Don't cry, sir. My mum will save you. The child was 5. She had no concept of dukes or titles. She knew only that this man bled, that he fought to conceal how badly, and that somewhere beyond the tree line, men were already exchanging coin for information about her whereabouts. She knew none of that last part. She knew only that her mother could mend anything broken. In this, she was correct. She was correct about nearly everything. If you have never watched a man who commands all things finally lose his grip on one, keep listening. It arrives in Chapter 3. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell us, what would you have done in June's place? Autumn in the year 1820 descended upon Wiltshire the way it always had, without apology. One morning, the air held only coolness. By the next, it carried the jagged edge of frost, rolling from the hills in iron-grey curtains that pressed the grass flat and stripped the oaks of their final dignity. The fields surrounding Ashwick, that broad, half-feral expanse stretched between the Duke of Thorne's estate and the village of Combe Hadley, turned the colour of tarnished copper. Lovely and lifeless at once. Pip Whitby had been instructed, no fewer than 4 times that week, that she was forbidden from entering those fields alone. She was 5 years old. She received this prohibition the way she received most of her mother's rules, with great solemnity for roughly 3 minutes. Then not at all. It was not defiance, precisely. It was that Pip carried an imagination so vivid it operated as a second set of senses entirely. She heard melody in the wind. She traced figures along the ridgeline. She felt, on that particular Tuesday morning in October, that something of consequence waited beyond the stone wall bordering their cottage garden. Something that required discovering. She was not mistaken. He lay face down at the base of a shallow slope, half concealed by tall, tawny grass, bent flat from the previous night's rain. His horse, a magnificent dark animal that had clearly formed its own opinion about the circumstances, stood some 20 yards distant, grazing with monumental disinterest. The man's coat was of a quality Pip had never encountered at close range. Deep charcoal wool, impeccably tailored, now caked with mud and torn through at the shoulder. One boot was gone entirely. His right hand pressed flat to the earth, as if he had attempted, and failed, to force himself upright. Pip approached the way she approached most things, directly, without pause. Her head tilted at that precise angle of inquiry she wore like a signature. She crouched beside him. He breathed. She could track the slow, labored rise and fall of his back. Blood darkened at his temple, drying brown at its edges. His jaw remained clenched even in unconsciousness, which Pip found remarkable. Most people softened in sleep. This man looked as though he were fighting someone behind his own eyelids. She placed her small hand against his shoulder and shook him with full conviction. A sound escaped him, somewhere between groan and language, and his eyes opened, unfocused at first. Then sharp with something close to alarm, as they found a child's face staring down at him in perfect composure. His voice, when it arrived, was raw with pain, and with the specific shock of a man who had never once in 34 years of living been discovered at a disadvantage. He demanded to know what on earth she was doing out here. Pip informed him without theatre that she was finding him. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. He blinked. Something moved across his features. She would not have possessed a word for it then, but years later, much later, she would recognize it as the first fracture in a wall that had taken a lifetime to construct. He attempted to rise and produced a sound Pip had only ever heard from wounded animals. She returned her hand to his shoulder, not restraining, steadying, with a certainty uncanny for someone her size. She told him not to try that again. She told him he was hurt. She told him her mother was a healer, and she would fetch her now. And then, because she could read in his expression something she recognized, that specific tightening near the eyes that meant a person was terrified, but would sooner die than confess it. She spoke the words that would later be repeated in whispers, then in drawing rooms, then in the particular mythology that always grows around love stories told long after the living of them. __quote _0 __. Benedict Thorne, 5th Duke of Thorne, Lord of Ashwick Hall and 12,000 acres of Wiltshire farmland, had not wept since the age of 9. He had no plans to begin now, but something in the absolute conviction carried by that small voice made it impossible to say as much. He simply looked at her. This remarkable child with mud caking her boots and utter certainty shining in her eyes. He said nothing at all. Pip nodded as if his silence were consent. Then she rose, smoothed her coat with immense dignity, and ran. June Whitby had been awake since before dawn. This was nothing new. Over the past several years, she had trained herself to sleep in the shallows, never the deep, half listening always for Pip, for a knock at the door, for that specific quality of silence that meant something had gone wrong. She was 28 years old. She had understood early that rest, like most luxuries, was not always something she could afford. She was at her work table when Pip came through the garden gate at a speed that signaled either excitement or catastrophe. With Pip, the distinction was often impossible to draw. The door flew open, the child's cheeks blazed scarlet, her breath arriving in vast, shuddering gusts, her eyes wide with the enormity of what she'd discovered. June was already in motion before the explanation reached its midpoint. She seized her kit, the leather satchel she kept packed and waiting, because in Coombe Hadley someone always needed her, and was through the door with her cloak half-fastened and Pip's hand locked in hers. The child talked without pause the entire way. A man, very large, lying in the Ashwick field. His horse stood nearby, but he could not rise. Blood on his head. He was trying very hard not to appear frightened. June listened with the part of her mind that sorted facts and released the other part, the part already assessing, already cataloguing, to race ahead. She was prepared for a great many things when she crested the embankment. She was not quite prepared for him. Not because of his appearance, though she registered that too. The sheer breadth of him, the quality of the coat, that particular way a man of power holds himself even while lying injured in a field with absolutely no command over the situation. What halted her, for just one half-breath, was the expression on his face the moment he saw her. She had been looked at in many ways throughout her life, with pity, with suspicion, with the specific, cold appraisal of people who considered her profession an insult and her unmarried state a scandal. She had been dismissed, condescended to, spoken over by men who understood a fraction of what she knew about the interior workings of the human body. Benedict Thorne looked at her the way a man regards the sole candle burning in a dark room. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then his face shuttered closed, and he became whoever he ordinarily was. Formidable, contained, plainly accustomed to having his wishes met without question. He informed her in a voice still carrying the ghost of authority despite his position on the ground, that it was entirely unnecessary for her to trouble herself. He was perfectly well. His man would arrive shortly. June placed her kit on the earth, knelt beside him, and offered no response to any of it. She simply took his wrist, 2 fingers pressed firm against the pulse point, and began to count. When she had what she needed, she moved to his head. She examined the wound at his temple with the steady detachment of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by the difference between a viscount and a carpenter when both were bleeding. He watched her work. She could feel it, that distinct quality of attention from a man unaccustomed to being the subject of scrutiny rather than its source. She told him he had a laceration at the right temple, bruised ribs along the left side. She pressed there, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed it. She suspected a sprained left ankle rather than a fracture, though she would need to examine it properly. She asked him to tell her the year. He replied, with magnificent irritation, that he was not addled. She told him to tell her the year regardless. He told her the year. He told her the month. He told her, with considerable acid, that he also knew the name of the Prime Minister and the distance from London to Edinburgh, and that he wanted very much to know who she was, and what, in the name of God, she believed she was doing. June settled back on her heels, met his gaze directly. It was the look she kept for patients who masked their fear with belligerence. She gave him her name. She told him she lived in the cottage on the western edge of the Ashwick grounds. She informed him that if he kept quarrelling with her, rather than letting her do her work, the ankle would balloon to double its size before his man could reach them. And she would have no choice but to cut away what was left of a very costly boot. Silence followed. Pip, who had been perched a respectful 3 feet away, with her hands folded neatly in her lap and the expression of someone enjoying a very fine performance, announced brightly that she had told him her mother could fix. Benedict Thorne looked at the child, then at the woman kneeling beside him in a field, sleeves already pushed past her elbows, satchel open, and not one flicker of deference in her bearing. He said, with the grudging exactness of a man who weighed every word and rarely offered the ones that cost him, that she could proceed. June had already proceeded. She simply nodded without glancing up and got on with the business of saving him. Benedict Thorne had come into his title at 19, when his father succumbed to a fever the finest physicians in London could not arrest. Along with the dukedom came 12,000 acres, a moderate debt, 3 dependent sisters, and a reputation as the most unapproachable man in 3 counties. A reputation that had only deepened in the years since. It was not cruelty. Those who knew him, truly knew him, and that was an extraordinarily short list, understood the difference. He was not cold because coldness pleased him. He was cold because he had learned at 19 that warmth was exposure, and exposure carried consequences. His father had been warm. His father had trusted. His father had offered his hand to men who clasped it with a smile and quietly engineered his destruction. Benedict had spent the decades after setting things right. The debt cleared by the time he turned 30. The estate restored. His sisters, Cecily, the eldest, wed to a decent man in Bath. Eleanor, the middle one, who had no use for marriage and every use for horses. And young Harriet, just 17 in 1820, whose approaching Bath season had become a source of considerable household dread. All settled or settling. He had achieved it through discipline, through precision, through an absolute refusal to be anything less than completely, terrifyingly in command. The fall from his horse was therefore an outrage. He had been riding the eastern boundary of the Ashwick property, something he did every Tuesday, a ritual so fixed it had become nearly ceremonial. When a pheasant exploded from the grass directly beneath his horse's hooves. The animal, normally steady and named for a Roman general, shied hard to the left. Benedict had very nearly held his seat. Very nearly was not enough. He lay in that field for what felt like a long time before the child discovered him. Long enough to grow furious. Long enough to feel beneath the fury something worse. Genuine fear. Not of the pain, which he could manage, of the stillness. The inability to simply order his body upright and be done with it. He had lain there and felt, for the first time in years, utterly powerless. And that powerlessness had pressed against his chest like a stone. Then a 5-year-old with mud on her boots crouched at his side and regarded him as though he were a problem she fully meant to solve. Then her mother arrived. He was carried back to Ashwick Hall on a makeshift litter. His housekeeper, Mrs. Pryor, her face when she saw the state of him was a masterwork of restrained horror. And June Whitby had come with him, because the ankle required proper wrapping and the laceration proper cleaning. And because she had, he would realize only later, never once sought his permission. She had simply come, kit slung over one shoulder and the child beside her, as if the possibility of his objection had never crossed her mind. It probably hadn't. He watched her work in the ground-floor sitting room that Mrs. Pryor had transformed into something resembling a medical suite with admirable speed. June moved through the space with a competence so absolute it bordered on aggression. She spoke to him while she worked, not with the cautious deference most people wore in his presence, but in the direct, clinical manner of someone who regarded him first as a patient and only distantly as a duke. In 34 years of life, that was entirely without precedent. Pip occupied a chair near the window, surveying every object in the room with the methodical precision of a very small naturalist. A strange, quiet standoff, one that could not possibly hold. At some point, she lifted a paperweight from the side table, a heavy piece of Venetian glass, and turned it in her hands with careful reverence before placing it back in exactly the same position. Then she folded her hands in her lap again. Benedict, whose attention had wandered toward the child despite himself, heard himself ask how old she was. June replied without glancing up from his ankle. 5, she said. 6 in March. He asked, and could not quite explain why he asked it, since it was hardly the sort of question he posed to strangers. Whether the child was always so serious. June looked over at Pip, and something crossed her face, something private and vast, pressed immediately into a small, sideways smile. She said Pip was serious when she was thinking. The rest of the time, she was absolute chaos. Pip, from her chair by the window, said she preferred the word thorough. A brief silence followed, and then Benedict Thorne, who had not laughed in what felt like the better part of a year, who had found precious little cause and had not particularly noticed the absence until this exact moment, produced a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. It startled him. It seemed to startle June as well. She glanced up at him, quick, just once, then away. He found himself turning that look over in his mind long after she had gone. He had no intention of going back. The ankle mended, the laceration closed. Within a fortnight, he was riding again, a different horse since the Roman general had been retired from active duty with some ceremony. And the incident in the field had taken on the quality of something that had happened to another version of himself. A temporary version. one who had lain horizontal in wet grass, while a woman who owed him precisely nothing spoke to him honestly. He thought about her more than was warranted. He thought about the way she had pressed her fingers to his wrist to count his pulse, impersonal as a clockmaker, and how he had felt absurdly the warmth of that contact for hours afterward. He thought about her voice, direct and clear, with an occasional dry edge suggesting she found certain things faintly amusing, but considered it unprofessional to say so. He thought about Pip by the window with the paperweight, so careful and so grave. He rode to Bath to see his solicitor. He attended to the correspondence that had gathered during his convalescence, reviewed the home farm accounts, approved a new drainage scheme for the eastern fields, wrote a long letter to his sister Cecily that addressed, with considerable diplomacy, the question of Harriet's upcoming season. He was extraordinarily busy. He thought about June Whitby constantly. In the third week after the accident, he appeared at her door. He had told himself on the ride over that he was there to pay her properly for her services. She had refused any payment at the time, a refusal that both irritated and unsettled him, since a completed transaction left no obligation, while an unpaid debt had a way of lingering. The payment sat in his coat pocket. That was the reason. He had a reason. The door was opened by Pip. She regarded him with the same expression she had worn in the field, total, assessing calm, and then said, without inflection, that he was the man from the grass. He confirmed that he was. She considered this. Then she stepped back and held the door open with the gravity of someone performing a ceremony of great civic importance. He ducked his head to enter. The cottage had been built for people of ordinary height, and he was not of ordinary height, and he found himself inside a space entirely unlike any interior he had occupied in recent memory. Small, not elegant, but so thoroughly and specifically inhabited that it felt almost alive. Herbs hung drying in bunches from the low beams, books stacked in a system that appeared to follow a logic entirely their own, by frequency of use perhaps, or by some system only June herself understood. A child's drawing was pinned to the wall beside the window. A house, a woman, a small figure that was likely Pip herself, rendered with remarkable precision for someone her age. A work table bearing 4 separate mortars and a row of glass vials sealed with wax. June emerged from the back of the cottage, drying her hands on a cloth, and stopped the moment she saw him. She did not look startled. She looked, for one brief instant, like someone adjusting a calculation. He told her he had come to pay her. He named a sum. She opened her mouth to protest, and he told her quietly, but with unmistakable finality, that her protest did not interest him. A short silence followed. Then she said he could leave the payment on the table. She would make tea if he cared to wait, because Pip had been asking questions about him since the accident. June thought it wiser if he answered them himself, rather than leaving the child to fabricate her own versions, which Pip was entirely capable of doing, and the results could be alarming. He was willing to wait. Pip, who had been sitting at the work table pretending to read a book that was quite clearly upside down, set it aside at once. She arranged herself across the table from him with great deliberateness. Without preamble, she asked why he had been riding alone, if he knew pheasants lived in that field. He replied that he had ridden that boundary every Tuesday for 11 years without incident. Pip countered, with the merciless logic of the very young, that past safety was no promise of future safety. Perhaps he should bring someone along, or look where he was going. From the back of the cottage came a sound that was not quite a laugh. He stayed for an hour. He had planned on 10 minutes. Walking back to where his groom waited with the horse, he found himself thinking about the following Tuesday with something he did not immediately recognize. It had been so long since he'd felt anticipation that he almost failed to name it. Coombe Hadley was not an unkind village, but it was a small one, and small villages ran on information the way mills ran on water, constantly and in only one direction. June had lived there 3 years, since she was 25. She had arrived with a child, no husband, and a satchel full of knowledge that local opinion could not decide whether to appreciate or distrust. The suspicious faction had largely surrendered after she reset the blacksmith's dislocated shoulder at 2 in the morning without flinching. And then saved the miller's wife from a fever that had been turning dangerous for 4 days. The grateful faction required far less convincing. But always, underneath, the questions lingered. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she learned what she knew? Whether a woman alone with a child and firm opinions about medicine could truly be trusted. These questions arrived with varying degrees of kindness. June had learned to answer them with as little detail as possible. She kept her history small and her usefulness visible. The Duke's visits, then, did not escape notice. He returned the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He was always formally dressed. That was simply how he existed. He always knocked with a precision that suggested he had considered the correct force of a knock and settled the matter in advance. At first, they spoke about medicine. He had questions regarding the treatment of his tenants' various ailments. A practical concern. A sick tenant was an unproductive one. She answered without condescension and without pretending she knew more than she did. Then their conversations shifted. He held strong opinions about agricultural drainage that were, she discovered, rooted in genuine expertise. She held views on the obligations of landowners to their tenants that were equally grounded and considerably sharper. They disagreed on several points of principle. Those disagreements had a particular quality, she noticed. They sharpened both of them. She left those conversations feeling more awake than before she'd entered them, and she suspected, from the way he leaned forward whenever she raised a point he hadn't considered, that the effect was mutual. Pip inserted herself into these visits with absolute confidence. She'd made up her mind with the unshakable certainty only a child possesses. She liked the Duke. Pip asked him questions with the bluntness of someone who hadn't yet learned that powerful people expected deference. She showed him her drawings. She explained, at truly remarkable length, her theory that the starlings massing in the field at dusk were conveying something specific, and that she meant to decode it. Benedict received all of this with a seriousness Pip found entirely fitting. He told her that starling murmurations remained one of the great unsolved puzzles of natural history. Pip said she was aware. That was precisely why she would be the one to solve them. He did not tell her she couldn't. June marked this. She marked everything about the way he behaved with Pip, the absence of that familiar adult condescension, the way he addressed questions squarely, never slipping into the simplified tone most grown men adopted with children. It revealed things about him his public reputation had utterly failed to communicate. The village observed all of it, and the village talked. June let them. She had long ago accepted that other people's words lay beyond her governance. She could only govern what she did, and she was doing nothing that shamed her. She was, however, doing something that had begun to terrify her. She was falling. She had never told him about Pip, not in the way that mattered. He knew the child was hers. She had said so in the field, and he'd never pressed the point, because no one presses what appears obvious. A woman with a child was the child's mother, the most natural conclusion in the world. But Pip was not her daughter by blood. Pip was her daughter by decision, which was, June had always held, a far more enduring thing. Decision, though, was not something the law regarded with any particular tenderness. In Wiltshire, in 1820, it was not something society regarded at all. She had found Pip in Bristol in the winter of 1816. January, savage that year, the cold settling over the city like a second occupant. June had been studying under a physician there, absorbing what she could through the informal apprenticeship that was the only path open to her. A colleague had asked her to examine a child in the charity ward. 4 months old, left at the hospital door. Fever, malnutrition, a rattle in the lungs that had the nurses speaking in hushed tones, the tones people use when they have already resigned themselves to an outcome. June had not resigned herself. She sat with the child for 2 days without sleep. She did everything she knew, and several things she was not entirely sure of. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. The child looked up at her with dark, steady eyes that held, even then, at 4 months, that quality of absolute focus which would later see Pip cataloguing the contents of a duke's sitting room with the precision of a small scientist. She had not meant to keep her. She had meant to find a proper arrangement, something sanctioned. But the arrangements that materialized did not satisfy June, and weeks stretched into months. By the spring of 1817, she'd acknowledged that the question of what to do with Pip had answered itself some time ago, without her deliberate consent. She moved to Coombe Hadley in the summer of 1817. Pip was not yet 2. Bath was too costly. Bristol held too many people who knew her history. Wiltshire lay far enough from both to offer something resembling a fresh start. She built her practice quietly, made herself indispensable, constructed a life that was narrow in certain dimensions, but wholly her own. She had also overheard her name once in a corridor in Bristol, in a conversation not intended for her ears. A lord's name, a man of standing who had arranged for an inconvenient child to vanish. She never confirmed it. She decided that knowing precisely wasn't worth the peril that confirmation would invite. She had not told Benedict any of this, partly because the moment had never arrived naturally, partly because she was uncertain how a man of his position would receive it, and partly this was the portion she was least proud of, because she treasured the way things stood, and she feared what truth might do to them. She should have told him before anyone else could. She did not tell him in time. They came on a Wednesday in November, 2 men in a hired carriage, unremarkable in every way except the sharpness of their attention. They moved through the village asking questions about June Whitby, about the child, about where they had come from, how long they had been here. Mrs. Olcott at the post office delivered the news that same afternoon, wearing the careful expression of a woman who genuinely likes you and hates what she's about to say. 2 men, she said, asking about Pip, asking who her father was. June kept her face perfectly still. She thanked Mrs. Olcott. She walked home at her usual pace, locked the door, sat down at her work table, and thought very carefully about what this meant. She believed it meant the name she had overheard once in a corridor in Bristol had finally caught up with her. She did not go to Benedict straight away. She was not yet certain what the men were after or how much they knew, and telling him would require telling him everything. She had not yet found the language for everything. What she failed to anticipate was simpler than that. In a village of 300 souls, two strangers asking pointed questions about the Duke's particular friend would reach Ashwick Hall before those strangers had finished their supper. He was at her door that evening. Pip was asleep. June opened the door and read his face, that specific, terrible stillness, and understood he already knew something was wrong. Not the details, the shape of it. She stepped back to let him in. He entered. She lit a second candle. They sat across from each other at the work table, enclosed in a small circle of light, and she told him everything. Bristol, the charity ward, the fever, and the 2 sleepless days. The woman who had brought Pip in, weeping, with nowhere left to turn. The name June had heard once in a corridor and never spoken aloud. She told him about the move to Wiltshire when Pip was not yet 2, the life she had constructed, the calculations she had made, that distance and silence were the strongest shields available to her and the child. She told him she was sorry she had not said it sooner, that she had been afraid, that she was telling him now because she needed to, not because she was asking him for. She was very precise about that last part. She was not asking him for anything. He said nothing for a long time after she finished. The candle trembled in some draught neither of them could trace. The cottage settled around them. From the back room came the sound of Pip breathing, deep, steady, entirely untouched by the conversation being held about her future 1 wall away. He said at last that she was the most comprehensively infuriating person he had encountered in 34 years of living. His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man saying one thing while meaning something else entirely, and not yet prepared to name what he meant. She asked what he intended to do. He told her he intended to discover exactly who had sent the men, why they had come now, what they wanted, and then to deal with it. He said this with the flat conviction of someone for whom dealing with things was simply what one did. Then he added, without meeting her eyes, that he meant to address something else before he left. She waited. He said he did not wish to stop coming on Tuesdays. He said he found he could not quite tolerate the idea of this cottage and these books and Pip's theory about the Starlings becoming something he merely observed from a polite distance, before returning to his properly ordered life. He said, and this was the part that cost him most, she could see it in the set of his jaw, that he was asking her permission to continue. Not to resolve anything, not yet, simply to continue. June looked at him. She considered what she was risking. She considered what she would forfeit if she refused. Not him, precisely. She barely permitted herself that thought. But the Tuesday afternoons, the arguments about drainage, the way he listened to Pip with the same exacting attention he brought to everything, as though no subject was too minor to deserve precision. She said yes. He nodded. He stood. He put on his hat. At the door, he turned back and told her to lock it properly tonight. He would be in Bath at first light. She said she knew how to lock a door. He said, with the shadow of something, not quite a smile, that she knew how to do most things, and that it had been among the first things he'd noticed about her. Then he was gone. June locked the door, returned to the work table, and let it all sit inside her. The fear about the men, the uncertainty of what came next, and beneath it, stubborn and inconvenient and entirely her own, something that felt dangerously like hope. What Benedict did next required two things: the accumulated weight of a title 5 generations deep, and that particular coldness people had always held against him, which now, at last, served a purpose he did not regret. He spent the morning in Bath with Hartwell, his solicitor, a man of 20 years' faithful service who understood without instruction that certain inquiries needed to happen swiftly and leave no trace. By early afternoon, Benedict had the name. By evening, he had confirmed it. The men had been dispatched by a solicitor representing the estate of a lord who died in July of 1820, 3 months before they appeared in Coombe Hadley. The dead man had left his affairs in chaos. A posthumous review had uncovered an irregularity. A child. An arrangement made in haste, executed without the family's full knowledge. The deceased's younger brother, who stood to inherit, whose accountants grew nervous at anything threatening to complicate the succession, had commissioned a quiet inquiry. He wanted the loose thread found, and if possible, cut. In the end, it had nothing to do with Pip. It was about a dead man's secrets and a frightened brother's fortune. Benedict sent a note that evening requesting a meeting in Bath the following morning. He phrased it as an invitation. It was not. The brother arrived punctually. Men always did when a duke summoned them. Benedict received him in the private dining room of Bath's finest hotel, reserved specifically so there would be no witnesses. The man was perhaps 40, soft in the way men grow soft when they have never lacked for anything. He had the anxious eyes of someone who'd spent months bracing for bad news and receiving it in pieces. He sat across from Benedict, introduced himself, and said he understood they shared a matter of mutual interest. Benedict regarded him through a long, precisely measured silence. Then he spoke with the clarity of a man who had rehearsed nothing, because nothing required rehearsal. The child in question was under his personal protection. She would shortly be under his legal guardianship. Any further inquiry directed at the village of Coombe Hadley, at Miss June Whitby, or at anyone connected to either, he would treat as direct interference in his affairs. He was confident the brother grasped what that meant. He let the silence stretch again. The brother grasped it. The color drained from his face entirely. He said with care that he had no desire to create difficulties for a man of Benedict's standing. The matter could be considered closed. He hoped Benedict would extend him the same discretion he himself was prepared to offer. Benedict replied that discretion was precisely his intention, provided the men never returned to Wiltshire. They never returned to Wiltshire. He rode back to Coombe Hadley that afternoon and told June everything. He told it plainly, without embellishment. The facts, the outcome, the assurance. She listened with her palms flat on the work table, her face perfectly still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, almost to herself, that she had spent 3 years waiting for that threat to find her. He said it was finished now. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not the way a woman comes undone, but the way someone moves who has carried a weight for a very long time and has just, for the first time, been allowed to put it down. Her shoulders dropped half an inch, her breath released, slow. She said quietly, quote 6. He told her there was something else he wanted to say, and then he proposed. Plainly, the way he said most things, beginning with the practical consideration, because it was real, and he was not a man who ignored reality. Then, moving past it, to the thing underneath. He told her that if she became his wife, Pip would be his ward by law, placed beyond the reach of any posthumous reckoning with a dead man's mistakes. He said that was a practical matter, not the only reason he was asking, and he wanted no ambiguity on that point. He said he wanted to keep coming on Tuesdays. He wanted to argue about things that mattered and be told when he was wrong. He wanted to watch Pip catalogue the world with that extraordinary gravity of hers. He said he understood how little warmth he had offered over the course of his life. He could not promise to become someone other than who he was, but the man he was had discovered, since October, that Tuesday afternoons in a small cottage in Wiltshire were the finest hours of his week, and that seemed to him significant. He stopped. He had spoken longer than he meant to. He felt exposed, not the way the field and the wet grass and the cracked ribs had exposed him, because those were wounds of the body, and he knew how to bear those. This was the kind of nakedness that could not be endured, only survived. June asked him to say it again, without the practical consideration first. She was perfectly capable of protecting Pip on her own, and she needed to know the rest of it was real, not merely a solution hunting for a problem. He looked at her, drew one breath. He said the rest of it was more real than anything he had spoken in years. That it was this room, the drying herbs, the books in their baffling order. The way she pressed 2 fingers to a pulse point with the detachment of a clockmaker. The way she had looked at him in the field, not with fear, not with calculation, but simply as a person who required tending. He said no one had looked at him that way since he was 19, and he had not understood until recently what that absence had cost him. She went very still. Then she said, yes. The wedding was fixed for the 3rd week of December. In the days before it, the village of Coombe Hadley carried on with the barely restrained joy of a community that had collectively resolved to be delighted. Mrs. Olcott reorganized the post office twice for no discernible reason. The blacksmith's wife turned up at June's door bearing a cake and the expression of someone delivering a judgment she was satisfied with. Eleanor Thorne rode over from Ashwick and spent an afternoon with June discussing horses and latitude and the particular tyranny of social expectation. By the end of it, June felt quietly that she had gained a sister. She did not feel quiet the night before the wedding. Pip had been asleep for 2 hours, exhausted by the thrill of a new dress and the lengthy negotiation over whether her notebook could accompany her to the church, settled diplomatically. The cottage was still. June sat at her work table with a candle, her hands, and the relentless company of her own thoughts, which were not being helpful. She was not afraid of the decision. She was certain of the decision. What frightened her was the scale of what she was walking into. The hall, the name, the weight of his world pressing against the edges of the life she had built so deliberately in this small space. She was afraid of disappearing into the machinery of a larger existence. She had watched it happen to women, watched competence sour into obligation, and obligation into invisibility. She was still sitting with that fear when the knock came. She knew it at once. Measured, deliberate. His. She opened the door and found him standing in the cold December darkness without a hat, wearing the expression of a man who had committed to something and would not turn back. She stepped aside. He came in, ducking his head with the ease of someone who had done it many times, and stood in the center of her small kitchen and looked at her. He said he could not sleep. She said neither could she. He asked what kept her awake. She told him everything. The fear of losing herself, of her life reshaping itself past recognition, of whether she would still be allowed to work, to disagree, to remain the person she had forged through 3 years of stubborn, solitary effort. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, because she had resolved, some time back, that if she could not speak the true thing to him, the entire venture was already forfeit. He did not interrupt. She had marked this about him and treasured it. He listened the way he did all things, wholly, without fracture. When she was done, he sat quiet for a breath. Then he told her he had not proposed to some diminished version of the woman standing before him, that he had no interest in a wife who had softened herself for the sake of his ease, that the disputes over drainage and the ruined dinners and the tenants arriving at whatever door she happened to be nearest, these were not disruptions he intended to endure. They were the reason. They were precisely what he had been asking for. He said he needed her to be exactly herself, because he had spent 11 years enclosed by people who agreed with him, and it had made him worse than he might otherwise have been. He had only lately come to see it. June held his gaze for a long moment. The candle between them wavered in a draught, then steadied. She crossed the small distance separating them and pressed her hand to his jaw. Not the careful 2 fingers at the pulse point, the full warmth of her palm, the way a person touches someone they intend to keep. And he went utterly still. The same stillness that had overtaken him in the field when the child rested her hand on his shoulder, as though he had needed someone to stop him and had not known it. His hand rose and covered hers, only that. His eyes closed for a moment. She said, very quietly, that she believed him. He turned his head just enough to set his lips against her palm. Brief, deliberate, the first gesture of its kind between them, and by that very restraint, heavier than anything longer could have been. He told her she should sleep, that tomorrow would demand she be relentlessly competent, which was her natural condition, but that it would also demand a measure of patience with his younger sister, who wept at ceremonies and then denied it fiercely. June laughed. The fear that had lodged beneath her ribs since sundown shifted, not vanished, but smaller, the kind she could carry. He left. She turned the lock. She went to bed and slept. They told Pip together the morning after Benedict's proposal. At the work table, with toast and the drawing she had laboured over for 3 weeks spread between them. She was drawing the Starlings again, chasing the shape of the murmuration, the way 10,000 birds moved as one, the mathematics of it, the beauty that was also a kind of logic. June sat beside her. Benedict sat across from them both. June explained in clear, honest terms what had happened, what they had decided, what it would mean for the 3 of them. Pip listened to every word without interrupting, which was unusual enough to suggest she was turning over something of real weight. When June finished, silence settled. Then Pip looked at Benedict directly, that level, ancient gaze. She asked if he was going to be her father. He said, carefully, that he would very much like to be, if she would allow it. Pip considered this. She asked whether he would come to the field when the Starlings gathered at dusk. She needed a second observer to record from a different angle. Her mother's handwriting was less precise than the work required. He said he would come to every dusk she needed. She asked whether he would go on letting her pose questions even when they were inconvenient. He said, and June could see it cost him nothing, which told her more than 100 formal declarations ever could, that her questions were never inconvenient, that they were, in truth, the kind of questions the world needed considerably more of. Pip looked at her drawing. She looked at her mother. She looked at the Duke with the gravity of someone delivering a verdict. "All right." Then she returned to her Starlings. June met Benedict's eyes across the table. He looked in that moment like a man who had just been handed something he had not known was missing, startled by the weight of it, quietly undone in the best possible way. She understood the feeling completely. They wed on the 21st of December, 1820, inside the small stone church at Coombe Hadley. That morning, frost had turned every blade of grass in the churchyard to silver. The sky hung pale and washed blue, the colour midwinter keeps for itself. It was not a grand ceremony. Grand ceremonies had never suited June. And Benedict, she had come to understand, carried a complicated weariness toward performance. Not discomfort in public, but a bone-deep fatigue with ritual, enacted for show rather than meaning. Eleanor arrived on horseback. Harriet came by carriage and spent the walk to the church door, whispering to her maid that she was absolutely not going to cry. Cecily sent a letter from Bath, 4 pages long, closing with the declaration that she had waited years for Benedict to stop being impossible about his independence, and was exceedingly pleased he had found someone willing to share the weight. June's side of the church was smaller. Mrs. Alcott from the post office, the blacksmith and his wife. The miller's wife, recovered now, pink-cheeked, her husband's hand in hers. 2 women from the village who had carried their children to June in the darkest hours and received them back whole. These were her people, not grand, not titled, entirely real. Pip stood at June's side, in a dress she had approved after thorough inspection, clutching a small bundle of winter greenery. Holly and rosemary, chosen by her own hand, held with the gravity of someone discharging a duty of great civic weight. When the vicar reached the relevant moment, Benedict took June's hand. She felt the warmth of his grip, steady, deliberate, the same quality of attention he carried into everything, and she thought, briefly and completely, of the night before. His lips pressed to her palm, the fear that had contracted to something she could hold. He spoke his words with precision, as though he had weighed each one separately and arrived at it through genuine conviction rather than custom. When he finished, the look he gave her was unlike any she had known from him before. Not the candle in a dark room flash from the field, not the controlled focus of the cottage visits. Something settled. Something that had reached its decision and rested now beneath the full weight of it. She spoke her own words back to him, clearly, without hesitation. Pip, at this point, gave a single nod, the nod of someone confirming that proceedings were unfolding as they should. Behind them, from Eleanor's pew, came a sound that was absolutely not a sniffle. A year later, the Ashwick fields were copper again. Pip was 6 now, nearly 7, a fact she tracked with considerable devotion to the calendar. And she had her notebook, a proper one, bound in dark green leather that Benedict had presented on her birthday in a manner suggesting he had planned it well in advance, ordered it specifically, and was not going to make a great deal of it. She had filled 31 pages with observations about the Starlings, written in a hand already more precise than most adults managed. They were in the field at dusk, the 3 of them. Benedict stood with his own notebook. He had taken on the recording duties without ceremony, characteristic of him, and was noting the time and the direction of the murmuration's opening movement. Pip positioned herself 15 yards away. At the angle she had calculated offered the best differential perspective, doing the same. June stood between them. The sky over Ashwick was doing what Wiltshire skies did best in October, burning itself out in orange and violet, slow and total and indifferent to the humans beneath it. The Starlings swept in from the east, thousands, folding and unfolding across the field in shapes that were almost geometric and never quite. Every evening the same, both ordinary and impossible. Benedict moved to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers. He did this now without thought, the easy proximity of a man who had decided, comprehensively, where he belonged. She leaned into him by half an inch. He leaned back. A small thing, not a small thing. Across the field, Pip was writing furiously, face bent over the green notebook, the wool of her scarf trailing through the grass. She had a theory about the murmuration now. She had presented it at dinner the previous week with diagrams, standing on her chair for emphasis. It had everything to do with pressure gradients, how each bird tracked its 7 closest neighbors, how that tracking produced something that resembled purpose, but was actually far more compelling than purpose. Something purely reactive, purely present, purely alive inside the instant it occupied. Benedict had posed 3 careful questions. June had proposed an experiment. Pip had listened to them both, then announced she'd already devised something superior. She was nearly 7. She was already a full year ahead of either of them. The flock wheeled, every bird at once, that staggering collective turn, and the dying light caught their wings and struck them silver. June felt Benedict's hand close around hers. She thought about this same field a year ago. The large man in the wet grass, working hard not to look afraid. The small child who had discovered him and remained thoroughly unimpressed by his composure and entirely certain her mother would sort it. She thought about how a life assembles itself, never along the clean lines you draw, but along the sideways ones, the ones nobody anticipates, the ones that begin with a pheasant and a horse, and a little girl in muddy boots, carrying absolute faith in the people she loved. She tightened her grip on Benedict's hand. He answered in kind. That specific pressure, a man saying something he no longer required language for, something he had spent this past year learning he could leave unspoken. For someone who had once governed his entire existence through precision and control, that was a remarkable thing to have learned. Across the field, Pip glanced up from her notebook and shouted that the north pivot was occurring 3 seconds earlier than the previous week, and that this mattered, and she required someone to confirm the time. Benedict called back that he had it logged to the second. Pip said good and returned to writing. June laughed. The full kind, the undefended kind. The kind she had rarely permitted herself during those years of holding everything together alone. It surfaced easily now. It had been surfacing easily for months. The Starlings turned once more, and the sky went on burning, and the 3 of them remained in the field until the light bled away, and darkness rolled in from the east, and the birds dissolved into it. 10,000 separate creatures becoming for one more night the single beautiful thing they made together. This was the life. Not the one any of them had designed, not orderly, not arranged, not reached by the most direct route, but full, completely, stubbornly, irreversibly full. It turned out that was more than enough. If Benedict and June stayed with you, if Pip's confidence landed somewhere you weren't expecting. Subscribe and leave a comment. What would you have done in June's place? Said yes, or made him wait?